have three inner beings inside of you at this moment. You have your writing self, but you also have your inner cheerleader.
Yay!
And your inner critic.
Boo!
Which one of those last two do you think that you listen to the most? If you are like most writers, it is that dastardly inner critic. Your inner cheerleader is usually easy to identify. She says, or he says, things like this.
Oh, this story is so awesome, I can't wait to get writing on it again. That string of dialogue, genius. The ending you wrote, I was in tears.
Hear any of these statements and you know that's your inner cheerleader cheering you on. The problem is that human beings have an innate negative bias built in to our brains. Scientists have found this to be true. Even when testing little tiny babies, they have found that for the first 6 months of their lives, they search for happy expressions. But starting at about 6 months, they began to be more affected by negative expressions. We began to form this negative bias early on. Scientists believe it is a survival mechanism. We have to be attuned to danger around us, and so our brains learn to set up the red alert the instant there might be anything that might harm us around. Your inner critic comes from that biological development. It has been there all along, but for some reason when you try to do a creative endeavor, particularly as an adult, he gets really loud. As children, we tend to create for the pure joy of creating. But later on, as we mature, what happens? What other people think starts to be very important to us. Our brains know that if we create something and then someone criticizes it, that hurts, that wounds us. So the brain tries to protect us from this by forming what we know of as the inner critic. The inner critic tends to grow and develop inside of us with every experience we have as writers. From the very first report that we may have turned in at school, and perhaps the teacher gave us a D instead of that A that we were hoping for. Something I created was not good, and these other people around me didn't like it, and oh, that is not fun. I don't want to go through that again. So later on, when we start to write stories, and perhaps we send them to an editor and we get rejected, or we put them on the blog and there's some negative comment, these little things start to teach that inner critic that humiliation and criticism do not feel good. And our brains want to protect us from that. Meanwhile, the inner cheerleader inside of us, well, she gets a little bit quieter as we go. She will still say, oh, that was a lovely story, but then if we put the story out there and it gets criticized somehow, then the cheerleader thinks, well, my gosh, was I wrong somehow? I thought it was a lovely story, but they didn't. So gradually, as we go along in our writing careers, the inner critic becomes more and more prominent in our brains, while the poor inner cheerleader shrinks down to a little tiny pom-pom sized cheerleader. So you go to sit down to write, and you're excited at first because you have a scene that you're looking forward to, and your cheerleader is going,
oh, good for you, you're sticking to your writing routine.
While your inner critic is going,
I don't know if you're going to be able to pull off this scene. It's an important scene in the story, and I'm afraid you're probably going to mess it up.
And what he's really saying is,
it might be best for you not to even try, because if you try and then put it out there and then it's criticized, you know that's going to hurt.
The inner critic is doing everything it can to protect you from being hurt. Oh no, we can't have that. Here's another scenario. You're halfway through your novel and you're feeling so good because you're making progress, and your inner cheerleader goes,
I can't believe you've gotten this far already. Fantastic, good job.
But your inner critic, well, what does he have to say?
I don't know. This story doesn't seem to be going very well.
Or how about when you're ready to go publish the book? Your inner cheerleader is so excited. But what does your inner critic say?
This is your last chance. You should stop now.
Who do you listen to then? Here's something for you to think about. In a way, your inner critic is right. When you put your work out there, it is frightening. There is the possibility of criticism. You may get bad reviews. You may not sell as many books as you hope. So your inner critic is not wrong. But you have to decide whether you want to listen to him or to your inner cheerleader. It is not that one or the other is right. Both of them are right. The problem is most of us have a negative bias built into us biologically, so we tend to naturally default to the inner critic. We have to take the extra effort to listen to our cheerleader. So how do you do that? Have a journal where every night you spend perhaps 5 minutes recording what your inner cheerleader said to you that day. This is one way to elevate the inner cheerleader's messages in your mind. Anytime the inner critic has something to say to you, do not accept it at face value. You must ask yourself, so is this really true? Let's say that you publish your book and the sales are not as good as you hoped. And your inner critic says,
I told you, the story wasn't good enough.
Question what the inner critic is saying. Maybe the marketing plan was the problem. Maybe your platform is small. Don't believe the first thing that comes out of the inner critic's mouth. You must question it, realizing that though the inner critic is trying to protect you, he is not some all-seeing, all-knowing being. He is simply the protective, negative bias inside of your brain. When your inner critic starts telling you that your story is crap and it's no good and you really should give up and go do something else, simply agree. Okay, yeah, the story's no good, but then go write anyway. What this does is it helps to diminish the inner critic's status in your brain. If you told the friend this story's no good, you really should give up on it, and the friend said, all right, you could be right. I'm going to keep working on it anyway. Wouldn't you feel a little affronted? Oh, you're not taking my advice? That's how the inner critic feels. And maybe he won't be so quick to give his opinion next time around. Whenever your inner critic starts tearing you down, you need to stop and purposely ask your inner cheerleader what he or she thinks. So let's say the inner critic says,
That scene was horrible. You should just scratch it out. It was no good.
Instead of just accepting that is the truth, ask your inner cheerleader. Remember, he or she is always there, just quieter. So ask, what do you think? Did you think it was horrible? And let the cheerleader answer. When you purposely ask your inner cheerleader, you will always get advice that is more constructive and more motivating. And finally, the most important thing to remember when the inner critic is babbling on in your head is that it's so easy to tear something down. You don't have to know anything about it. You can simply start criticizing it. The inner critic, see it as the vapid, shallow being that it is. The more that you can do that, the more you diminish the inner critic's importance in your creative process. This Halloween, I challenge you to see if you can quiet the inner critic in your mind and listen more to your inner cheerleader and see how that may help you to reach your writing goals. Happy Halloween, and see you next time.